Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. The sun beats down on a vast plain of cracked earth. Wind stirs up fine dust that has lain undisturbed for thousands of years. In the distance, you see the silhouettes of towering stepped temples, rising like mountains built by human hands. This is Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. But we're not here to talk about Babylon or Assyria, whose names still echo in history books. No, we're going further back before the pharaohs built their pyramids, back before Abraham walked the earth, back to the first true civilization ever known, Sumer. This is where it all began. The very idea of city was invented here. Streets lined with houses made of mud brick, vast irrigation canals carved from the land, temples that served as both religious centers and storehouses of grain, and in quiet corners, scribes pressing styluses into wet clay, inventing the very first writing the world had ever seen. But Sumer is not simply ancient history. It's a forgotten truth. A civilization so old, its memory faded even for those who came after. Clay tablets lie buried beneath the sands, inscribed with the first myths of humanity, of gods who walked among men, of councils in the heavens, of great floods sent to destroy civilization itself. And these aren't just legends. These stories inspired later traditions, echoing in the Bible, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the roots of our own cultural DNA. Sumer gave us the first schools, the first contracts, the first laws. They mapped the stars and divided time itself into hours and minutes. Yet for centuries, they were forgotten, their language lost, their achievements buried and dismissed. Today, we're going to change that. We're going to peel back the layers of time and dirt to uncover the hidden history of Sumer. We'll explore their lost cities, their myths, their inventions, and the secrets they left behind. Because if you want to know who we really are, if you want to understand the roots of civilization, you have to go back to where it all started, to a place older than the Bible itself, to Sumer. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast plain in southern Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago. The dawn breaks over a land of fertile mud, transformed by human hands into something extraordinary. Rising from this floodplain is the city of Uruk, the world's first true metropolis. This isn't a scattered collection of huts. It's an organized city with districts, temples, markets, and walls that stretch for miles. Tens of thousands of people live here, supported by a network of irrigation canals that turn desert into farmland. And at the center of it all looms the ziggurat, a massive terraced temple dedicated to the gods, its bricks stamped with the name of the king who built it. Sumerians didn't just build cities. They invented city life itself. They designed the first urban plans, with streets laid out in grids. They created neighborhoods for craftsmen, scribes, priests, and traders. The idea of specialized labor was born here. A potter shaping clay, a merchant tallying his goods, a priest reading omens in the entrails of a sheep. Even more astonishing is what they left us: the first writing system, cuneiform, marks pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. At first, they used it to record grain deliveries and taxes, but soon they were writing hymns, laws, treaties, myths. In those clay tablets lie the first preserved human thoughts. They also invented the wheel, not just for carts but for the potter's wheel, revolutionizing production. They calculated areas and volumes for their fields, giving rise to geometry. They divided time into 60 parts, creating minutes and seconds. They recorded the movements of stars, laying the foundation for astronomy. And their cities were more than just places to live. They were centers of power, art, and religion. Each city-state was a mini-kingdom, ruled by a priest-king who claimed divine authority. War and diplomacy shaped their world just as much as trade and farming. When you walk through the ruins of Uruk, Lagash, or Eridu today, you see the birth of civilization itself. Every modern city, from New York to Tokyo, can trace its DNA back to these dusty bricks and silent walls. This was humanity's first great leap, from scattered villages to complex societies, and it all began in Sumer. Picture yourself entering the heart of ancient Sumer. Ahead rises a massive ziggurat, its steps climbing toward the sky like a mountain built by human hands. Priests in white linen ascend in solemn processions, chanting prayers to the city's patron god. Incense burns thick and sweet. The people wait below, hoping for favor, fearing divine anger. This wasn't just architecture, it was ideology carved in brick. Sumerian cities were built around temples, the dwelling places of gods on earth. Each city-state had its own patron deity. Inanna in Uruk, Enlil in Nippur, Enki in Eridu. These gods weren't distant. They were landlords of the city itself. Humans were their servants, created from clay to ease their divine burdens. Imagine a world where everything, harvest, flooding, war, health, was seen as the whim of powerful, often capricious gods. The priests were intermediaries, experts in maintaining divine favor through offerings and ritual. They read omens in animal livers, interpreted dreams, and performed daily temple rites to feed the gods with bread, beer, and sacrificial animals. The temples were economic centers too. They owned fields, herds, workshops. They employed scribes, craftsmen, laborers. They collected taxes in grain and silver. In many ways, the temple was both church and bank, spiritual center and business hub. And the myths that shaped Sumerian religion? These were stories that explained the unpredictable world. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells of a hero king seeking immortality, wrestling with questions of death and the limits of power. Creation myths described gods fashioning humans from clay mixed with divine blood, a blend of the mortal and the sacred. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were instruction manuals for living in a world beyond human control. They taught humility before the divine, respect for order, and the dangers of hubris. When you think of Sumerian religion, don't picture simple superstition. Picture a grand system of meaning, a society that built its laws, economy, art, and daily life around the belief that humans and gods were forever entangled. Even now, when we study those crumbling ziggurats and baked clay tablets, we're peering into the first great human experiment in understanding the universe and our fragile place within it. Imagine standing in a dimly lit Sumerian scribal school. A teenage boy leans over a fresh clay tablet, stylus in hand, pressing wedge-shaped signs carefully into the wet surface. The master scribe paces behind him, correcting his mistakes in a sharp tone. Outside, the city bustles with traders, farmers, and temple priests, all dependent on this new technology, writing. This wasn't writing for poetry alone, it was born of necessity. Sumer was a land of careful records. Tax receipts, temple inventories, land sales, court decisions, royal decrees, all had to be documented. At first it was simple. Tokens and clay envelopes tracking sheep, barley, silver. But over centuries it evolved. Pictograms became abstract cuneiform signs. Entire languages were transcribed in these wedges. For the first time, human memory wasn't tied to fragile flesh. It was baked in clay, nearly immortal. Imagine the power this gave the temple and palace. No more disputes over debt or ownership that could be argued away. Now there was proof, immutable as the tablets themselves. But writing wasn't only administration, it became culture. Epics were copied for generations. The story of Gilgamesh seeking eternal life, the lamentations over destroyed cities, hymns to Inanna that dripped with sensuality and awe. Even legal codes, like Ur-Nammu's, set down in cuneiform, laid out punishments and fines, a vision of justice made permanent. Picture a royal scribe recording the king's victories, turning battle into legend, ensuring the ruler's deeds would never be forgotten. History itself was invented here, not just memory, but a curated narrative, crafted to shape how the future would see the past. Writing was power. It gave priests control over ritual, kings control over law, merchants control over trade. But it was also democratizing in its own slow way. As scribal schools trained new generations, knowledge spread. The very act of writing tied city to city, generation to generation. Even today, archaeologists crouch in the dust of ancient libraries, brushing off tablets that speak in the voice of a civilization 5,000 years gone. And when we read them, lists of oxen, hymns to the gods, contracts for barley, we're not just studying Sumer, we're watching humanity's first great experiment in capturing thought itself, making memory eternal. Picture the dawn in ancient Ur. The sun rises over the ziggurat, casting long shadows across a city of tens of thousands. Narrow streets bustle with traders unloading boats on the Euphrates, children running barefoot past mud-brick houses, donkeys braying at crowded markets. It feels alive. It was alive. Sumer's cities were the first true urban centers humanity ever built. These weren't mere villages. Uruk, Ur, Lagash. They were city-states, each with its own god, its own king or ensai, its own armies and diplomats. At their heart stood the temple, part granary, part treasury, part spiritual headquarters. Priests controlled enormous tracts of farmland. They oversaw irrigation canals snaking like veins through the dry land, turning desert into gardens. The cities competed and cooperated. Treaties carved on clay tablets, raiding parties in the night, vast walls rising to keep out enemies, crumbling and rebuilt over generations. Imagine standing at the city gate, watching the enemy approach across the plain, the dust of their chariots rising like storm clouds. But for all their grandeur, these cities were fragile. Sumer's prosperity rested on careful water management, and if irrigation went wrong, if canals silted up or salinization poisoned the soil, harvests failed. Imagine fields turning white with salt, farmers abandoning lands, entire districts collapsing. And always, politics, alliances formed and shattered. Ambitious kings claimed to rule all of Sumer, only to be overthrown by the next warlord. Lagash conquered Umma, then fell in turn. Uruk built empires twice over, only to fade back into rivalry and division. Think of the human cost. Scribal records listing conscripts, prisoners taken as slaves, families torn apart. And yet even as wars raged, trade thrived. Lapis from Afghanistan, copper from Oman, timber from distant mountains. Sumerian merchants wrote contracts in cuneiform and sent caravans across deserts and seas. Cities rose on the promise of wealth and protection and fell when that promise broke. In time, the Akkadians would conquer Sumer, absorbing its cities into an empire that stretched to the Mediterranean. But even they used cuneiform, prayed to Sumer's gods, wrote their laws in Sumer's script. Sumer may have fallen, but its cities birthed something eternal. The idea that people could gather in one place and create a civilization, a fragile but astonishing pact to live together, share resources, tell stories, and remember. Picture yourself in a museum, staring at a baked clay tablet, its surface covered in wedge-shaped cuneiform marks. It seems so small, so humble. Yet this was the first writing, the seed of everything we know about history. The Sumerians didn't just record trades or taxes, they wrote myths that echo even now. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's first epic poem. It tells of a king who defies the gods, searches for immortality, mourns his friend. It asks what it means to be human. Imagine an ancient scribe reading it aloud in flickering lamplight, while listeners lean forward, captivated. Sumer gave us bureaucracy and the city-state. Laws written down so rulers couldn't change them at will. Schools for scribes, where students practiced their signs over and over. Generations of teenagers muttering curses at clay tablets, just like kids today complain about homework. But mysteries remain. Scholars argue about Sumer's origins. Who were the first Sumerians? Did they migrate in from somewhere else? Their language has no known relatives, no easy explanation for where it came from. It stands alone. And what about the king list, a document that mixes myth and history, listing kings who supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years before the flood? Were these real dynasties? Or echoes of older traditions now lost? Or the temples themselves, ziggurats rising like mountains from the plains, covered in glazed tiles of brilliant blue and white? We don't know exactly how ceremonies worked inside. Priests guarded their secrets. Did they chant hymns we can no longer hear? Perform rituals we only guess at from fragmentary texts? Even their daily lives hold riddles. Who first thought to ferment barley into beer? To make the first love songs, scratched onto clay in a script no one else had seen? To carve a cylinder seal so you could roll your signature across wet clay? The Sumerians left us much, but never all. They vanished into time, their cities buried under sand and silt. And when later civilizations rose, they borrowed and built on what Sumer had made, often without remembering its name. But when we read those clay tablets today, when we see those wedge-shaped marks made by a reed stylus thousands of years ago, we hear whispers, not just of ancient deals and decrees, but of people trying to make sense of their world, to explain the unexplainable, to leave a mark that would outlast them. Imagine standing in the ruins of Ur or Eridu at dusk. The desert wind sighs through broken walls. The sun sets over crumbling ziggurats, casting long shadows, and you realize these stones once framed the world's first cities. It's easy to think of Sumer as ancient and irrelevant, buried under millennia of dust. But in truth, we live in its shadow every day. The idea of city government? Sumer. Written law? Sumer. Schools, contracts, receipts? Sumer. Even the way we divide time into 60 seconds, 60 minutes, that's Sumerian mathematics. Their myths shaped later cultures. The story of a great flood survived in their epics, reappearing in Babylonian and Hebrew traditions. Their gods had personalities and politics that laid the groundwork for how humans imagined the divine for thousands of years. Yet Sumer is also a cautionary tale. These brilliant, organized city-states fought over water rights, traded blame for drought, and turned on each other in endless wars. Their irrigation canals, which once brought life, eventually salted the soil. Crops failed, cities emptied. Civilizations that seem unshakable can collapse from within. And in the end, their language disappeared. Cuneiform fell silent. Even the great ziggurats crumbled. But their ideas didn't die. They spread, adopted, transformed, repurposed by Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, and finally by us. When we study Sumer, we're not just deciphering old clay tablets, we're confronting the origins of human civilization itself, asking what it means to live in cities, to codify laws, to worship, to make art, to tell stories about who we are. That's why these ruins still matter, why museums hold their tablets like treasures, why scholars devote lifetimes to translating their texts. Because in those wedge-shaped signs pressed into wet clay so long ago, we see ourselves, our ambitions, our fears, our creativity, our need to be remembered. And if we're wise, we'll learn not just from their brilliance, but from their mistakes. we'll see that civilization is both fragile and resilient, that it depends on how we care for it. So next time you see a dusty fragment in a museum, pause. Imagine the scribe shaping those signs by lamplight. Hear the whispers of the first storytellers. And remember that our story didn't begin in modern cities or nation-states. It began here, in the mud and reeds of ancient Sumer.